everyone, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee. It is April 19th, a Friday, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about a new transfer portal rule that has just been passed, along with a NIL rule that we will get to here in the first segment. Then we're going to jump into a little bit of a Colorado update. Everyone is talking about the Colorado Buffaloes, as they do very often, and I want to break down what's going on with them heading into the second year under Dion. Then we're going to get into some spring game previews. A ton of stuff going on Saturday, so definitely want to break down everything for you guys there. And then we will get to Cinderella candidates for 2024. But before we jump into all of that, I want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your questions on the screen is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun interactive experience here, ask a question, make a comment, and I can read it out loud and we can have a fun back and forth. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. Before we jump into the first segment, I do want to address the elephant in the room. If you are watching live, first of all, thank you so much for watching live. It does mean a lot to me in the network in general, but you might see a premiere in the corner of the screen. That is because this is a pre-recorded show that I'm doing here today. This is not a thing that is going to continue very long. I will be back live on Monday, so no worries there, but I need to do one pre-recorded show here because I'm going on vacation tomorrow, so wanted to make sure you guys had something to watch, something to keep you updated on the world of college football. But let's jump in. Let's talk about this new unlimited transfer rule, this new NIL rule, and let's start with the transfer rule because that feels like what everyone has a big-time opinion on, right? Everyone has been looking for some answers to what is going on in the transfer portal and what will go on in the transfer portal for the next couple of years. And a new rule has just allowed multi-time transfers to get immediate eligibility. So essentially, that rule that was in place for quite some time where you could transfer once with no penalty, but then the second time you had to either get a waiver or sit out one of the academic years to be able to play, that is no longer in place. Now, it wasn't in place for the past couple of months just because there was a little bit of a temporary restraining order that was filed in West Virginia because of Raekwon Battle, who was a basketball player at West Virginia. He was a third-time transfer, and they wanted him to play right away. They filed an injunction and were able to get that essentially stayed for the time being. So that rule didn't apply for the last couple of months, but that was a temporary change. Now it is a more permanent change, and something that will be very, very interesting to kind of watch unfold over the next, even couple of weeks, because this is something that will likely be ratified on Monday. They're meeting on Monday to ratify any of these things that they see fit, and to be totally honest with you, I would be shocked if this was not ratified on Monday, and that is right smack dab in the middle of this transfer portal window we have going on, which is just a remarkable thing to think about. It's something that you're kind of throwing a grenade already into a crazy situation, so it's going to be wild to watch. There's no two ways about that. I think some of the things that everyone has kind of worried about over the last little bit when you talk about the transfer portal and everything around it is kind of coming true slowly, right? You start to see more and more people start transferring, more and more people start transferring multiple times, and now that we're giving them total autonomy to do essentially whatever they want with the transfer portal, it's going to lead to problems. Now, I have seen some people out there start saying, so people can transfer in the middle of weeks and start playing for another team. No, that cannot happen. There are still those transfer portal windows that have to be abided by. You cannot just enter whenever you want. But at the end of the day, if you are in good academic standing with both your school and the school that you are going to, you will have no problem. So obviously a huge flip. It's something that is thrown into this transfer portal period that has already had a couple of ers and ahs here and there, not necessarily the big-time craziness that I think a lot of us were expecting, but still a lot to unpack for sure. And I think there will definitely be a couple more people that start looking at that as a real possibility, especially people that have transferred multiple times but might not love the situation they're in. They might start looking at it as a real possibility to find somewhere else to play instead of possibly having to sit out a year. So, and one of the other things from this ruling that I think will really, really impact kind of the future of the sport is we've seen more and more some of these kids that will enter in the December window and then go back in the spring window, depending on different circumstances. Caden Proctor did it this year, and there are many others actually that did it in this cycle. I feel like it was something around like 15% of the people that had jumped in had already been in earlier this year. So just a remarkable number, and something that I think will only increase as you give these players more power to kind of do whatever they want to a certain extent, to have the ability to kind of jump around willy-nilly and do these things. As long as you have the grades, you're good to go type of mentality. I've talked about it a number of times, and I think the big thing here is giving all these players all this power is mostly a great thing, right? You want to see these players be able to find the right place for them to end up and start playing really good football. But at the end of the day, when you look at the amount of power that we are giving these kids, the amount of ability we're giving these kids to move around and do things of that nature, but not giving them the ability to do that smoothly or to do that with all of the knowledge in hand, or to not get it taken advantage of in certain circumstances, in those scenarios, we're not really doing them justice. There's this idea, I think, around college sports in particular right now, because of all the changes that are going on, that we need to make it as much of a professional sport as possible, so make these kids as much in control of their futures as possible. And to be totally honest with you, it's not that I am against these kids having all the choices in the world, and they absolutely should be able to find another place if the place that they start off with does not work out. I just think there's a difference between doing something like that, holding kids, for 5 years. I think that's the worst idea, but also there has to be a happy medium here, right? There has to be an area where we can all sit down and say, okay, this makes sense. This is a structure that benefits the kids in the sense that they can find where they want to go, but also doesn't necessarily give them full autonomy to kind of just play around with the transfer portal as they see fit. That is obviously a very dangerous way to go about business. That's a really dangerous way for schools to be able to look at the transfer portal. I think when you look at this way the schools that are approaching it right now, it's a very aggressive approach. Like, let's be totally honest. And I think if this was fully ratified, which it's going to be, let's be totally honest, that becomes tenfold. The ability for these teams to essentially just parachute into a kid's living room and say, we'll offer you X, Y, and Z if you come over here. Maybe they're not even willing to do that. Maybe the X, Y, and Z that they're referring to don't really exist. So that's really the biggest worry for me, is there's this era right now that we're in where there's so much change, there's so much instability, there's so much uncertainty, that I think coaches are kind of capitalizing off that. And it's not necessarily to say that they shouldn't be. There is an era here where certain schools have the ability to tip the scales in their direction. And if they weren't doing that, then their fans would not be too happy with them, I think. So it's not necessarily that they shouldn't be fully going after these kids and being aggressive in the portal and, as bad as it sounds, possibly using some of the gray area in NIL to their favor, but there's a dangerous road here. And I think we're, down it quite a ways at this point, but I think this just pushes us almost over a cliff, to be totally honest with you, at least for the next little bit. But let's get to the NIL agreement that was also struck in this meeting. I think this is something that obviously we will probably hear less about just on a day-to-day basis in college football, but will be very interesting in the long term to figure out kind of what does NIL look like overall. So NIL has been something that they've been talking about for quite some time, trying to find some type of structure that just makes sense. And I think they were able to find at least something. It sounds like the universities are now allowed to help the athletes find the NIL contracts that they would like to participate in. So it's a very interesting difference from when the kids essentially had to go out and find it on their own. These collectives were totally separate from the school. Now the school can kind of get involved with the collectives and push the kids in that direction to help them find the NIL deals that they would like. Now, the trade-off in that is that any deal over $600 has to be disclosed to the school. So all of the big-time deals that we've heard so much about behind closed doors will now not be behind closed doors. They will be public record that everyone can kind of get and access pretty much at will. So it'll be a really interesting thing that definitely helps the idea of NIL going forward. It helps people who are kind of on the fence about NIL, who are very skeptical of the idea. It gives them, an idea of at least we have some type of control over this. We have some type of, I don't know what word I'm looking for, some type of structure over this entire operation. We'll know what's going on. We know that some schools aren't wielding this incredible amount of money from some unknown source to get a big-time recruit because those would have to be disclosed now. And this comes after there was a big deal down in Miami with two big-time women's basketball players, Haley and Hannah Cavender, who actually were in the news today because they're going back to Miami. But they got into a little bit of trouble with essentially going to straight meeting with a booster named John Ruiz. That would now be legal. That would be totally allowed under this new ruling, and that would be something that would have avoided Miami and these two girls from quite a bit of headache. But at the end of the day, they're a little bit later on this than some people would have hoped. And I think the interesting thing about this is there's going to be so much change going on with NIL, with the transfer portal, with conference realignment, with all of this stuff, and you'd love to have an idea of just what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And I think this NIL rule at least helps that. You won't really get to see the underbelly of college football. I don't think 99% of us watching this or doing this will ever be able to see exactly what happens every single day throughout college football, because some of it is very, very much behind closed doors and will never find the light of day. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this kind of impacts not only the way that NIL deals are done for these college kids, but how it's kind of viewed by the public. You'll be able to see a lot of this stuff firsthand. You won't have to take, some random NIL valuation for face value. You'll be able to look up the number, and unless they're just racking up $500 deals, you'll be able to get an idea of what the pecking order is. And it'll be a very, very interesting thing once it comes around to possibly, becoming contracted employees or becoming more involved, the university that is, in paying these athletes. You'll be able to see the pecking order. You'll be able to kind of get an idea of maybe how the salary, how the collective bargaining, whatever it is, revenue sharing, whatever that ends up being, how that can be split among the athletes. You'll get an idea of who brings in the most money, who brings in the least, who is the most advantageous for us to pile money into, who is the least. So it's going to be really weird, and I think both these rules are going to be very influential for the short and long terms of this sport. Just the future of the sport is going to ride a lot on these rules. I think the transfer portal rule is dangerous in a lot of different ways. I think it will have a negative impact not only on the sport as a whole, but but on the kids. I think it really will have a bad impact on these kids. I think there will be a number of kids who are super talented that just get caught up in a spur of the moment decision, decide to move on from a place that they probably should stick it out at, and fall short. And it's not necessarily something that doesn't happen now, but I think it will happen at a much higher clip if we give these kids essentially free reign over the transfer portal. Now, the NIL rule, I think, is something where you can take it or leave it, to be totally honest with you. I don't really fully understand why they have to disclose all this information, but at the very least, it will give everyone the idea of, at least you know what's going on. You have a peek behind the curtain. You have an idea of what the NIL deals look like and kind of how they're operating. So at the very least, it gives you the people that are very skeptical of the NIL world, it gives them a peek inside it, so they can draw maybe a more accurate conclusion. Maybe they'll draw the same one, but maybe at least a more informed solution. So I think it'll be really interesting to watch these two things unfold. The transfer portal rule will start unfolding very, very soon because it's being ratified on Monday, and we are still in the midst of a big-time transfer portal window. So I think there could be some guys that are rethinking their decision right about now. And then the NIL rule will have long-lasting effects for quite some time until a new structure is put into place. So we'll keep a track on all of these. We'll see what happens over the next few months, over the next few weeks, and over the next few years. I think a lot of stuff is going to be unfolding over the next little bit, and maybe these rules don't last for very long. Maybe they last forever. Who knows? But at the end of the day, we will keep you updated with everything you need to know there. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Colorado. There has been so much coming out of Boulder that I want to break down just where they're at and where they could be going into 2024, and we will do that right after this, so stick with us.